Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Melinda Herring, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center here in Washington, D.C. We've brought together four great experts today to talk about the big question: is Putin going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine? We're joined by Deborah Kagan, who's at the Transatlantic Leadership Network and a fantastic expert on weapons. Deborah, so glad to have you. Victoria Vositskaya, a former MP in the Ukrainian parliament and an energy expert. Victoria, welcome. General Philip Breedlove, no stranger to the Atlantic Council and a dear friend of ours. And finally, Ambassador John Herbst, the director of the Eurasia Center. So we're going to do this in our normal way. We have an hour together. I have a number of questions, but I invite you to participate in our conversation, either on Twitter or use the Q&A function. I'd like to start with Victoria. Victoria's in Ukraine, and she is in Lviv now and safe and sound, and we're really glad to hear that. But Victoria, we were all struck by the news this week. Putin is claiming that Ukraine wants to use a dirty bomb. Why is Putin saying that? What do you read about that?
Thank you, Melinda. Thank you for having me here today. I think when it comes to questions or statements that Putin is making in regards to who is planning to do what, we all would agree that when he says that, he means that it's actually Russia and his regime is planning to do that. So I would retranslate it to the statement and say it's the Putin who is thinking and his regime on using the dirty bomb in Ukraine in particular. The real question is why he wants to use the dirty bomb and what's the purpose and what's the objective. Well, it's clear at the stage that Russia is losing this war and Ukraine is winning the war. And obviously the dissatisfaction and anger is growing within Russia, first of all, and second of all, especially in the closest circles of Putin. And they demand revenge for the losses of the territory, revenge for the losses of military, of equipment, and not achieving the goals that were clearly communicated at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So why the dirty bomb? The dirty bomb is actually the mean to create significant damage for Ukraine. And it can be done by attacking and using Ukrainian nuclear power stations. In particular, let me give you an example of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, where we've got not just the plant itself, but the facility for the spent nuclear fuel. And this facility, as was mentioned by the energy regulator, was built for the peacetime, not the wartime. And Energoatom, the company, the Ukrainian company that owns Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, just recently, yesterday, made a statement that Russians are doing something on that facility, building something, doing some operations, and no one from Ukrainian side, Ukrainian experts and representatives of IAEA, International Atomic Agency, have any access to this site. So if Putin decides to create a dirty bomb, he can easily use this particular facility and create a disaster that will spread definitely to the territory of the nuclear power plant itself and will cause major issues, health issues, humanitarian issues, ecological issues, and economic issues for us, for sure, and for the employees of the plant.
Victoria, let me interrupt you, though. When we spoke 2 weeks ago, you said, I don't think it's likely that Putin is going to do any nasty business at Zaporizhzhia. And you think it's more likely that if he uses a nuclear power plant, which one would he use?
The probability of using both the southern Ukrainian nuclear power plant and Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant are more or less the same. Why I was saying 2 weeks ago that it's more likely that he will use southern Ukrainian nuclear power plant, because he was not doing anything on Zaporizhzhia. But the indicators are just, unfortunately, the bad things are evolving so fast that it's really what was the conclusions made 2 weeks ago. They can change within a week or 2 weeks' time. So if such an event happens on Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, we need to understand that the contamination will be in and around Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. 25% of the electricity that was produced on the plant will become unavailable for Ukraine for a very long time. So it will have not just a short-term devastating impact, but a long-term devastating impact for the region, for that part of Ukraine, and for the economy overall. So the modus operandi of Putin's regime right now is to cause as much of a damage to Ukraine because they are losing on the battlefield, use other parts of Ukraine and critical infrastructure to cause as much damage and pain for Ukraine as possible.
Thanks, Victoria. That was really good. General Breedlove, could you please assess the likelihood that Vladimir Putin is going to use nukes? Where are you on this question? And if you were on CNN and they're asking you to give a probability, is it 5% or is it 20%? What number would you give? And you're muted, sir.
So it's a great question, and frankly, my opinion has been shifting as we have getting closer and closer to what is now looks like an impending loss in the south. After a strategic loss north of Kyiv, after a strategic loss north and east of Kharkiv, now we see operational and tactical losses in the south that could roll up into something bigger. I think that the probability has probably increased. I still believe that Mr. Putin understands how impactful this would be for him, for Russia, and for others. They're already a pariah state, but they might lose some of their closest allies if they take this next drastic step. So I believe it's probable, but I am hopeful that Mr. Putin understands that the cost to him would be incredible, and therefore will make a much more prudent decision.
Could I have a number, sir? Are you closer to 5 or closer to 20?
I'm over half glass full on this. I think that he will probably back himself into this corner.
Okay. I was sleeping well until I spoke with you. Deborah, where are you on this question? Could you assess the likelihood that he's going to use nukes?
I'm in a little bit different place. I think that he's not the one who's pushing the button, and his military is going to have to play in a dirty battle space if he does this. And I think his military is going to counsel against this. But I think another important issue here is China, India, Iran, all those countries are probably counseling him against this because it kind of ruins their facade of being nuclear, near nuclear powers, because they depend on the threat of their nuclear stockpile, which, even in China's case is not competitive with the United States. But clearly, this is India's whole thing with Pakistan over Kashmir. And this upsets their apple cart of having this threat and being these nuclear states when there really isn't much there. And they don't want Putin to then go use a nuclear weapon, which would then sort of call into question their value of their own deterrence. So I do think he's getting counsel from countries that he does talk to saying that don't do this. This is unwise, and this puts us in a bad position based on our nuclear deterrent. But I also think let's not rule out that his military would rather he not do this because they think they understand. I thought yesterday, the Pentagon released the National Defense Strategy, and the nuclear posture piece was part of this. And I like that Secretary Austin is again using the term that General Breedlove knows well, strategic ambiguity, which is a nice way of saying we're the biggest superpower on the face of the planet. We have lots of stuff. Don't test us. And I think that's a good thing to say. And I think it's good to leave it at that. And I think that's something that Putin is looking at.
So, Deborah, I need a number. Where are you on the scale?
I would say I'm in the opposite direction. My glass is about an eighth full.
Okay, sounds good. Ambassador Herbst, please help us understand something strange that happened. Putin went on air and said that he's not going to use nukes. Why is he saying that now? What does it mean?
It is part of a charm offensive aimed at conservatives in the United States and also in the West. He's paying attention to things being said by populist Republicans in the United States, which can be used to turn America's staunch support for Ukraine off. And as he talks about, there are two Wests, one which has traditional values like his, quote unquote, since he doesn't really have traditional values. He's a KGB officer whose value is Russian imperial control, but he will still play that. And so as he addresses them, he wants to say, I have no intention of using nukes. Even as multiple times Russia has threatened, quote unquote, escalation. And it's worth recalling that Putin and other senior officials said in mid-February they had no intention of sending a large invasion force into Ukraine. And at the same time, Putin has cultivated an image as someone who would never accept retreat, the proverbial rat in the corner, which has now become a staple of Western analysis of Putin's intentions, which to me makes that perhaps the most amazing and successful psychological operation that Putin's ever pulled.
John, can you, sure, go ahead, General Breedlove.
I just wanted to add, I saw a different, first of all, John is brilliant and I sign up to everything he just said. But let me offer what my first reaction to Mr. Putin's statement yesterday. Russia has been singing about this dirty bomb thing. They're setting the world up to either push us again or false flag an attack. And I saw yesterday as just another underlying push to the world. Something might happen, but it's not us. We promise we're not going to use nukes.
Thanks. That's important. Deborah, did you want to jump in? Oh, you're muted, Deborah. Press your button.
I want to hear what John has to say in response to that.
I agree with Phil on the dirty bomb. The Soviets had a very regular tactic, and Putin is nothing but a Soviet apparatchik, to blame the United States of things that it was doing or of things that it were about to do. So I agree 100% with Phil that this quote unquote warning from Russia that Ukraine is going to do a dirty bomb isn't indicated that might be what they would do. The fact that the United States, and for that matter, the other major Western nations, have simply dismissed this as nonsense reduces the risk of Russia pulling this. But the fact they're talking about it means it's conceivable. And by the way, I don't rule out the possibility of Putin using nuclear weapons, but Deborah, I'm even below your 12.33%.
John, could you explain even more? Let me have you pull on that. Why won't he use nukes? What are the arguments against it?
The principal argument is that if we're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, and I think that's what we are talking about, it will not affect Ukraine on the battlefield significantly. That's the most important reason. The second reason, also important, is that, thank goodness, over the past 5 or 6 weeks, the Biden administration has laid out exactly the right response to Putin's nuclear blackmail, which is essentially tee on and say, we have nukes too. And if you do something, the consequences will be devastating. Although, again, using Phil's language, you're using the language of classic nuclear deterrence, we have strategic ambiguity without saying precisely what we would do. That's the second reason. But you still can't rule out the possibility that he will use. Actually, and Deborah's reason about would the Russian military go along is also very important. It's not like Putin's the one who pushes the button and then the nukes go off. But you still can't rule out the use of nukes. But again, I don't think it's likely.
Thanks, John. Victoria, how do things look in Kiev when Putin says he's not going to do it? How do you guys read that situation?
Well, first of all, we understand that Ukrainian army is slowly but surely approaching Energodar and is working on liberating that part of Ukraine. And this is the city where Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is located. And I fully agree with the general, with Ambassador, with Deborah, that Putin is unlikely to use the nukes because he doesn't have to if he wants to create a nuclear disaster. He can create it on the site of one of the nuclear plants and blame Ukraine and Ukrainian army for attacking the Zaporizhzhia, for example, nuclear power plant, the one that is occupied right now by Russians, and uses as an excuse for a disaster that will happen, and will try to convey the message to the world that it's the Ukrainians who caused the problem. He will most probably make a link to Chernobyl and say, you see, it's Ukrainians again who are causing major disasters for Europe. So think twice before actually doing something and providing Ukraine with the help. So it's very important for everyone to realize once again that whatever Putin is saying that the Ukraine is planning to do, it's him and his regime who is considering such an option to create a nuclear disaster by attacking the nuclear power plant and that specific facility of the used nuclear, spent nuclear fuel. That's the first point. The second point about the using the tactical nuclear weapon, I think Kyiv has already communicated to the outside world that, well, we're expecting a fair response, and I think that the response is clear. And as Ambassador mentioned, and General mentioned, everyone understands that it's completely unacceptable for big powers like the US, for Russia to threaten the whole world with using the nukes. So we are happy with the response, but we definitely want to make sure that we have enough support in terms of weapons, in terms of anti-missile system that we need to cover and protect our nuclear power stations, our other power stations and substations that Russians are attacking and making Ukraine an unlivable place. That's what we need to focus our attention on right now to survive this winter.
Absolutely. Thank you, Victoria. General Breedlove, so our nuclear experts say that Putin is mostly likely to use a small tactical nuclear, if he's going to do it, in Ukraine near the front line. Ukrainian soldiers are spread out and dispersed, though. So does it really make sense? You said it doesn't make sense to use a nuclear weapon from a military perspective. Could you explain that more, sir?
Yes, so you almost did. The very fact is that there's not a target that is really suitable to a tactical nuclear weapon. That is a large massed formation of armor or something. And I don't think that Mr. Putin is really trying to accomplish any tactical objectives if he releases a nuke. It's if he did it, and I'd like to sort of requalify what I said earlier, but if he did it, he's attempting to bust up the alliance. He's attempting to further deter America, which I believe is his center of gravity, is changing America's support for this war. And so the nuke is much more about the psychological war of busting up the West than any tactical effect. Listen, Deborah said it before. His troops have no idea how to work on a dirty battlefield. They're not equipped for it. They're not trained for it. And he would create just as much a problem for his own forces as he would for Ukrainian forces. I really believe is about hearts and minds and busting up the support for Ukraine.
And just to put even more fine of a point on it, I think it's about scaring the Germans as well, right? That you start talking about the nukes and the Germans start shaking. So I think that's a piece of it. General, let me ask you another question. You talked about strategic ambiguity. So the Biden administration has warned that DC, that we, Washington, will unleash catastrophic consequences if Moscow uses nukes. They haven't specified what those consequences would be, but if you were advising President Biden, what would you recommend that he strike?
So the bottom line is we are not going to say, and I believe that's right and proper, as John talked about. I do not personally believe that we would comprehend using a nuclear weapon to reply. I don't think the West would do that unless Putin did something more massive or something specifically counter-value. I think that the return nukes are completely off the table. But here, rather than saying specifics, let's just put it this way. What Mr. Putin's military has shown in this fight is that they are unable of striking in a conventional way that has large operational or strategic effects. But Mr. Putin understands that the West can do that. We don't have to use nukes to have a large effect on Mr. Putin's ability to fight. And I think that's what the West is thinking about. And what I would recommend is how could we respond in a convincing but proportionate way that would severely impact Mr. Putin's ability to carry on his conventional war.
Would you say anything more specific beyond that? Is that a strike in Syria? Is that a strike in Crimea? What would it be?
No, I think the strike would be it might be in Crimea, but it would certainly be in Ukraine. I think this is proportionate. We're talking. I don't think we look to widen this war. And we would do something that the world would understand is right and proper based on what Mr. Putin has done.
Got it. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. Deborah, John already talked about the rat in the corner argument. So this is an argument that I'm hearing in a lot of realist circles. They say that Putin has no good options, which is true, and that he's getting increasingly desperate. But are we making the situation worse and increasing the likelihood that he'll use nukes by increasing pressure on him? How do you respond to that argument?
Oh, gee, what an opening. So
go for it, run.
First, a couple of things. Building on what John and General Breedlove said, there's so much evidence based on what Russia was doing in Syria and Idlib and the like, that it was all air. They didn't go near Idlib after they used chemical weapons there because they just don't have adequate CRBN equipment to send their troops in there to do anything. So I absolutely agree with what General Breedlove said is, if you're sending your troops into harm's way, you might want to protect them. They don't have that protection any more than we really did going into Iraq. So let's just be honest that none of us sort of prepped this very well. The second thing is on the demonstration nuke, if I might, John has heard me say this before. I think people forget about Turkey. I heard about this demonstration nuke and near the Black Sea, and I start chuckling and I go, I think people forget that Erdogan considers the Black Sea his personal bathtub. And I think it's really, and I think the Russians know how important it is to keep Turkey on the fence here. And I just think this would, no pun intended, blow up that entire relationship and the Montreux Convention and everything that goes on in the Black Sea. So that's another reason. In terms of realists and other people, look, anytime someone mentions nuclear weapons, the hand-wringing in Washington is palpable. It's sort of like, oh my God, I can't sleep at night. There's one under my bed. It's going to go off any minute. But there's a couple of things here to point out. First of all, the implications, as General Breedlove said, are there's a reason why the United States didn't have a problem giving up its tactical nuclear artillery and the like, because weapons advances, especially in the last 10 years, have been so with high energy weapons and the like, have been so advanced that you don't need a nuclear weapon to do the amount of damage that you can now do with a conventional weapon. And that conventional weapon has incredible accuracy, which it didn't have 30 years ago. So you don't need to do that. That's also true of Russia. You can accomplish maybe what you want to do with conventional weapons. So other than this fear factor of making the hand-wringers, and the people who, as I like to call the arms control industry, worried sick that someone might have one more nuke than you or something like that. That's what Putin is striving for. There is not a logical military reason for this at all. And you don't really need to do it to do the same amount of damage without the concomitant dirty battle space. And then finally, I would tell the realists and the people who are hand-wringing over this is get over yourselves. This is not 1990. This is not 1986. This is not the situation where, it's just going to happen. And unfortunately, I would also say that it's great that you believe everything Vladimir Putin says. And that's really not a way that I would choose to live my life. But if you want to believe everything he tells you, every rumor, every this, every that, then that's your choice. Sorry for the sarcasm, but sometimes what I hear when I hear people moving in a direction that based on something that Putin stirs the pot, then he's already achieved his objective.
Fabulous. I want to start a podcast with you, Deborah. That was fantastic. I enjoyed that immensely. Ambassador Herbst, we need to have one more rejoinder to the realists. So the realists also love to cite the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they like to say, isn't it time that we behaved like a responsible power and found a face-saving compromise, that Moscow and Washington went to the negotiating table and tried to prevent more death and destruction now. What do you make of that argument?
I think that studying the past is very important. And I credit the Kennedy administration for handling that crisis very well. And I hope we can handle this crisis equally well. But that's not by blindly following the quote unquote lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. These crises are very different. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the provocation was Khrushchev placing missiles and atomic weapons in Cuba 90 miles from our shores. In this case, the provocation was launching a war on Ukraine, annexing quote unquote Ukrainian territory, not just murdering hundreds of Ukrainian people, but also seeking to wipe out quote unquote Ukrainianness. As Pavel Gubatov said, the Russian leader in occupied Donetsk, we will convince Ukrainians to be Russians. If not, we will kill them. And Medvedev, the former president, says again, the aim of the war is to wipe out Ukrainianness. So this is a war of war crimes. So what the so-called realists are proposing, somehow making an analogy out of the completely inappropriate Cuban Missile Crisis, is give Russia something the way we gave Russia something during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we gave them the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, which Kennedy wanted evacuated from Turkey before the Cuban Missile Crisis began. In other words, we gave them bupkis. In this case, what the so-called realists are saying, let's give Russia not just Ukrainian land, but Ukrainian people so the Russians can turn them into Russians or can extinguish them. You know, the realists would be much more realistic if they were to acknowledge the massive war crimes that Putin is committing, bordering on genocide, and were to say, yes, it's too bad, let's sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian people so we can sleep at night. Let them say that publicly, and I'll respect them as realists.
Okay, I think we need to have another debate with these guys. Actually, they won't even acknowledge that Ukraine is an independent state. That's their normal line. So, you know, if they can acknowledge that Ukraine is an independent state, we might be able to have a debate, right?
Right.
Victoria, before I turn to questions, you told me recently that you aren't as worried about nukes. You're more worried about, you have other winter worries. What are they, and what can the West do to mitigate them? You're very worried about Ukraine surviving the winter. Say more about that, please.
Yes, unfortunately, the winter is coming, and it's already here. In fact, what is happening is that Russians have been destroying our critical infrastructure, in particular targeting energy sector. In energy sector, in particular, targeting, first of all, power generating plants. We've lost already 1/3 of our power generation capacities, if you take the whole system. What helps is, of course, the drop in the overall economic activity, unfortunate drop of 40%. So we're not consuming as much as we used to prior to February 24th. But unfortunately, what we see is really like a cynical approach to destroying not just the generating capacity, which is hard. It's really hard to destroy a power plant that runs on coal or gas or anything like that. It's really, it takes lots of shelling and bombing. But what Russians are doing, they're targeting substations. And the substations are the stations that are used to deliver basically the electricity that is being generated on power plants to the final consumers. And there are different sizes of such substations. That they've started with the biggest one, and they're slowly but gradually destroying those that are of a smaller size, basically trying to destroy our energy system and create a situation where it's completely in imbalance, where we cannot balance our production with our demand, and we cannot deliver the electricity to people, to businesses, to cities, etc., etc. And what worries me is the fact that, for example, in Kyiv city, Russians managed to cause really major damages to part of our energy system, and we became totally reliable on electricity being supplied from outside of Kyiv, from other regions. And now out of 9 lines, there are only a few left that we keep on using. I don't want to use exact numbers because it will show our vulnerability, but it's a dire situation. Over 6 hours per day, we have blackouts. When we have blackouts, it means that we don't have not just lights in our apartments. Kyiv is the city, as most of our cities. It's a multi-story apartment building. So imagine you live on the 10th floor, is 12th floor, or whatever. You have a child or children, and you cannot get out because you have to go up and down. It's becoming impossible because the elevators, the lifts don't work. There is no mobile coverage or limited coverage. So you don't know what's going on. You don't get any news. Forget about internet access during those blackouts. Moreover, the basic necessities, like the basic services that you are used to when you live in a normal life, like running water in your tap water right in your apartment, or working sewage system, it's not working. And we call it Holodomor. It's the strategy that Russia is planning to implement this winter to cut our Ukraine, as many Ukrainians as possible, not just from the electricity, but from the heat supply as well. And imagine a city like Kyiv, Kharkiv, or any other major cities with people living in apartments where there is no heat, where there is no electricity, no way, by the way, to even cook a warm meal for your family, because in Kyiv in particular, significant number of apartments, they use electrical stoves. And it's a dire situation, and it's a matter of surviving. And in this regard, I do really hope that our partners will start thinking really seriously about providing us not just with the macro financial assistance, but assistance in forms of in-kind of equipment that we need. The equipment that will restore expeditiously the supply of electricity that we still can produce. Again, we can produce the electricity in the amounts that we need. It's just we are now facing problems with delivering it to the final users. That's the most critical part. So that's the situation. That's the dire situation. We need to survive this winter, and we really need to survive together, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Victoria. So if I understand your argument correctly, you think that Putin is going to use the Holodomor strategy and try to break the will of the Ukrainian people. And if that doesn't work, then he might consider some kind of dirty bomb. Is that a correct summation of your argument?
I would say that it is a correct, whether it's done in parallel or it's done in consequentially. What's the word I'm looking for? Please help me. One after another. It's a question. I don't know. But what I understand is that we need to get the equipment and the air missile system and anti-drone system ASAP to Ukraine. Otherwise, we will face a situation where it's not going to be just about people's morale. It's just Europe will face the second, even greater wave of refugees, numbered tens of millions. And if you do simple math, 10 million refugees multiply even by 500 euros per month, it gives you 5 billion per month of additional costs that European countries will then incur, and it's 60 billion per year. I think it's cheaper to give us the help that we need in terms of military support and in terms of the support of in form of equipment to replace and restore the electricity and heat supply and water supply.
Thanks so much, Victoria. I saw 2 thumbs from General Breedlove and from Deborah. Go ahead, General Breedlove.
So want to violently agree with both John and Victoria. First of all, as regards John's remarks, having raised 3 kids and now 2 grandkids, I really condense this into parent logic. If you allow bad behavior to stand, or worse, if you reward bad behavior, you will get more bad behavior. We rewarded bad behavior in 2008. We rewarded bad behavior in 2014. We'll be judged now whether we once again reward bad behavior in our dealings with Russia in this fight. And then as to Victoria, I would say that our hearts and souls understand what she has explained about Ukraine's winter. I'm as worried about the winter that Mr. Putin has in mind for Europe. It won't be as hard for the European nations as it is for Ukraine, but the goal is not to destroy their capabilities. It's to separate their people from their governments and to dissolve the support from European nations for Ukraine. And so the winter has come already to Ukraine. Winter is still coming to Europe. And what we've got to do is to fight to keep our support solid for Ukraine through what we know Mr. Putin is already doing, blowing up his own pipelines, cutting data cables, changing energy arrangements. He's going to try to separate Europe from its support for Ukraine. Over.
Thank you, General Breedlove. Deborah?
Yeah, just one thing on the energy side that I was thinking about, Victoria, while you were speaking is there is some excellent mobile grid technology out there now. We saw this being used in Lebanon when Hezbollah started cutting off the power grid to certain non-supporters. And I think there's something to be had in a conversation with the International Energy Agency to look at whether some of this mobile grid technology can be brought to Ukraine to deliver electricity to places that may have been cut off from the overall power grid infrastructure. So that's just one thought, because the technology is there. And I think we just have to get people who are much smarter than me to tell you how to do that. But I don't think that cutoff of infrastructure should be looked as a death knell for delivering electricity. I still think there are maybe ways to do that. And like I said, we've seen them happen in other places. And one last point on the Cuban Missile Crisis analogy. I think a better analogy is the Munich agreements that the Nazis chose to ignore in 1938 and then 1939 when they went into Sudetenland. I think that's more applicable than a bunch of Jupiter missiles that not only did Kennedy want to take out of Turkey, but as General Breedlove knows, we were phasing out anyway. Because we were moving toward our next generation. So it was beyond bupkis because we were dismantling these guys. But so I think the better analogy is not Cuba, but a better analogy is the discussions that went on in Europe at Evian, and then the agreements that were struck with Hitler in 1938 and how quickly they were broken by 1939.
Thanks, Deborah. We have 16 minutes to question these wonderful people. So if you haven't dropped your question into the Q&A, do it or send it to us on Twitter. If you guys could all unmute, that would be fantastic. Victoria, we're going to do a blitz round. I'm going to give you questions, and if you could give just a short answer so we can answer all these questions. We have 20 questions. General Breedlove, you are up first. This is from Voice of America. Eugene wants to know, how reliable are American intelligence tools to detect nuclear preparation, sir?
Well, one thing that the United States has never lost sight of is the nuclear business in Russia. During the years after the fall of the wall, when we were trying to embrace Russia, we lost contact with their operational and tactical level business. But I have great faith in our ability to understand the nuclear picture.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Ambassador Herbst, you're muted. Can you unmute, please? This is for you, will the outcome of the U.S. midterms have a serious impact on American support to Ukraine?
I believe that the strong support we see today will continue after the midterms. I think it's likely that folks skeptical of our support for Ukraine may be a little bit larger in the Republican caucus in Congress, but only a little bit. And the Republican leadership in Congress remains very strong. They have the clearest-eyed view of any of the Washington politicians on the danger that Putin represents to the United States.
Wonderful. Anyone else want to jump in on midterms? I see violent agreement from General Breedlove. Nope. Okay, great. General Breedlove, this is from Mehdi. He says, the West is not going to, if according to you, the West is not going to use nukes, where is the deterrence and or strategic ambiguity? Could you explain your argument more, please?
So I don't think my argument releases the ambiguity. We are a nuclear power. We are a very capable nuclear power, and our weapons in the world have demonstrated that they actually work when they're called upon to work. So we have a credible nuclear deterrence. What I'm saying is that the West does not want to escalate a spiral that Mr. Putin may start. And so the first way to not escalate that is to avoid using a nuke in response. I believe, as Deborah laid out, that, and as I said earlier, we have amazing demonstrated capability to make incredible impact on a battlefield with conventional weapons. And Mr. Putin is using his army to run over his neighbors. And if we do a conventional response that takes away that capability, it will be, I think, more impactful than us returning a nuclear fire.
Super, thank you. Victoria, this one is for you from Jack. He says, does Russia still feel confident of ultimately prevailing in Ukraine, eventually despite recent losses, and hence nukes won't be necessary? What do you think of that?
I didn't quite get the question. Can you
Yeah, sure.
rephrase it?
So even though Ukraine is winning right now, does Russia
Right.
still feel like it's going to win and it won't have to resort to nuclear weapons?
I think it's obvious that Russians is losing. I mean, full stop. There is nothing to discuss, and the Russians understand that. And the fact that yesterday at Valdai's speech, Putin mentioned only Donbass, the liberation of Donbass, as the aim of the special operation. He has forgotten to mention the Zaporizhia region, the Mykolaiv region, Kherson region, all the rest, especially those parts of Ukraine that were annexed last time. It's an indication that, of course, in Kremlin, they understand that they're losing the war. Using the nukes, as we already discussed on this panel, is not going to give any benefit to Kremlin and Putin in particular to win this war. I think it's a loose strategy.
Okay, super. I have a question from Paul Sullivan. I don't know who to aim this one to. This is about NATO. So raise your hand if you want this one. Water, communications, health, gas, and other systems don't work without electricity. What is NATO doing to get critical infrastructure running again so Ukrainians can survive the winter better? Who wants to take that? Does anyone know on NATO? We'll have to get back to you.
Say that Victoria made a wonderful appeal and speech just moments ago for there is more help that is needed, and we need to be there to help them with this. We are and still need to be focused on supplying Ukraine with what it needs to fight. And what we see now and what the question asked is wonderful, and that is, what are we going to do to allow and help Ukraine to survive this horrible winter that Mr. Putin has planned? I mean, his army has already demonstrated that they are rapists, they are torturers, and they are murderers. And now they're going to try to torture the population via starvation and cold. And so it's another area we need to get involved in.
Thank you, General Breedlove. Hans Benedijk wants to challenge you. He says, if there is a non-zero chance that Putin may use a tactical nuclear weapon, we need to think through the response as Biden is doing. So how would we respond beyond ambiguity, starting carefully with the massive sanctions and more arms sales, or with some version of shock and awe? You answered that in particular, but could you say, have any thoughts on sanctions or arms sales as well?
Well, I've said this in the past that there are some very important sanctions that are still left. I mean, we've kind of called the disconnecting them from SWIFT as almost the nuclear option. So there are massive things that still could be considered. That's not my area of expertise. I saw Hans' question. It's a great question. I'm just not going to speculate publicly on our military responses. I don't think it's a healthy conversation. I will say one more time, we are capable of inflicting incredible damage to Russian military forces with conventional reply.
Super, thank you. Another question from Hans, this is a good one. If in response to a Russian tactical nuclear strike, NATO forces attack Russian positions in Ukraine, NATO is at war with Russia. Do you agree? And where does that war go? And that's to General Breedlove again.
Well, yes, this is the $64 million question. In today's economy, $64,000 not good enough. But the fact of the matter is, if we return fire in Ukraine, we are at war with Russia. I would add, though, Russia's at war with us now. Yes. Russia is fighting us in all of our spaces except for directly militarily. The recent cutting of data cables, the cutting of energy, were in the last election and the election before that inside America. Russia is at war with the West now. The enemy gets a vote, and they have made their vote already. But clearly, if we reply directly on the battlefield in Ukraine against Russia, yes, Hans is correct. That is an act of war.
Thank you, sir. Deborah, question for you. Oh, I see your fingers just a minute, John. I'm coming to you in a second. This is from James. What other options does Putin have other than using a dirty bomb to achieve his victory? He can't withdraw or negotiate without losing face, yet seemingly can't make progress conventionally. How would you respond to that? And John, I'd love to have you respond to that as well.
I think that part of it is the way we've set this up. We don't use terms like victory. We talk about sort of tactical successes. Mm-hmm. In some ways, Ukraine is a victim of its own circumstances. They've been so successful that the United States and some other countries in the West are saying, well, they obviously don't need X, Y, and Z because they've done so well with what we've given them, which is kind of a death by a thousand cuts sort of approach. So what I would say about that is Putin has not used everything that he could use. Mm-hmm. I think he has strategic lines of communications issues. Otherwise, in the last 8 months, he would have done more through that Belarus corridor. But I do think that there are, and I look at General Breedlove when I say this, the old expression of ghost brigades. I think in NATO, we know, not to be mean, that when it comes time for troops to do countries to do the rotations and the rapid reaction force and the like, maybe 35 to 40% of these guys are not going to be able to fill up the units that they're supposed to fill up, and they won't have the critical enablers to do this. Well, take that to Russia in spades. So there are increasingly, we're figuring out that Russia has a lot of ghost units itself. Mm-hmm. Things that they say are active on paper, but they really don't have the personnel or the enablers to actually deploy them as good fighting forces. So I think it's time to reverse the strategy and let's have Ukraine actually do victory here. And victory, for me, is, and you guys have heard me say it before, is an Appomattox type of result here. And that will end this sooner rather than later, and it will not drag it out forever. I don't buy the argument that Putin's back is against the wall and he has to use a nuclear weapon unless he wants to, kill himself. And I'm not sure that his ego would allow that. I think that is not the right thing. I think the right thing to do is to give Ukraine what it absolutely needs to win now, and use words like win and victory, and stop talking about successes and mini failures.
Awesome. Thank you. Ambassador Herbst, you're muted, but we would love to have you jump in here.
Just wanted to follow up on what Phil had said. Hans did ask an important question, and I have a great deal of respect for Hans, for whom I once worked. But I think that there's one more element as we consider what we should do if Putin were to resort to some form of weapon of mass destruction. And that is, Putin's aims don't end at Ukraine's western border.
Exactly.
Deborah said in response to the Cuba analogy, the Munich analogy applies too, and I would agree with that. Some folks believe that NATO is so strong and NATO has taken additional steps over the past few years to further strengthen itself that Putin wouldn't dare strike against a NATO ally. Well, I think that's wishful thinking. We have seen statements from senior Russian officials from Putin himself about his objectives. And his objectives are to restore substantial Russian control, Moscow control across the entire post-Soviet space, which includes 3 NATO allies. And Putin regularly provokes our Baltic allies to demonstrate that he has the ability to mess with them. So I don't have any doubt that if Putin's intentions may include our NATO allies, the smart place to defeat Putin is in the large nation of Ukraine, whose able population of 40 million people are fighting for their existence as Ukrainians. And if in order to do that, we need to make clear to Putin that if he uses weapons of mass destruction, singular, we may well strike with conventional weapons. I would not have opposed using nuclear weapons directly at them, is a very good message to send. That decreases substantially, doesn't remove entirely, but decreases substantially the chances of him actually doing it.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Our last question is to Victoria, and it's from James Sayre. He says, what would the effect of a tactical nuclear weapon or dirty bomb have on the civilian population of Ukraine? Would they stay or go, Victoria?
Well, there will be those who will be affected, obviously. And we're the nation that survived Chernobyl. Let's not forget about that. And we've stayed on our own land. We've succeeded to survive. We have this DNA code of survivability within us. And we're not going to leave or get scared. Yes, we will mourn people who we will lose, like we're mourning all the people we're losing right now on the battlefield. But we will continue fighting, because this fight, this war, is the war of existential war for our nation, for our country, for our people. Either we win and continue to exist as a nation, or there is no plan B. We will win and we will survive. And we will all celebrate it together with our friends, our victory. I'm sure of that.
Victoria, we look forward to that day so very much. Thank you so much for joining us. This was a great conversation. It was a privilege to be your moderator. Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, General Breedlove. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Ambassador John Herbst. Thank you to our staff at the Eurasia Center, especially Benton. And we will see you next time. Keep your eye on the Atlantic Council website for more events on Ukraine. Thank you and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.